Let me go back here. Alrighty, well, we're going to get started here. And one second, real quickly, I'm just going to adjust something. And just confirming everyone can see the PowerPoint right now. That's all looking good. Okay, perfect. Okay, well, we're gonna get started here with our third webinar then. So tonight's webinar, I think, is a pretty exciting topic, and I'll talk about it obviously in a lot of detail. But it's based on some work we've been doing for a long time, and it's really the sort of accumulation of this work that's done the same way in and out, year in, year out. And I'll get into the details of that very soon. But before we begin, I want to thank everybody for being here because all of the registration fees for the folks who, for all of you who registered to be on this webinar, really go directly back to our project, which you then put towards our research and outreach. So just a big thanks from all of us for tuning in and for your interest in our work and also for supporting the project financially. I also want to put a little reminder that our last webinar of this winter webinar series is going to be in 2 weeks from today at 6:30 p.m. Central Time. And that's going to be on Where and How Wolves Kill Deer Fawns by Shawn Johnson Bice. So this paper, or this topic, is the result of a paper we recently published looking at how and where wolves kill deer fawns based on almost 1,000 fawns that were killed by wolves. So there's a lot of really great information in it, and it's going to be presented by Shawn Johnson Bice, who's about to complete his PhD at the University of Winnipeg. Shawn's been a close collaborator with the project for many years, and he actually led the research paper that he's going to be presenting on. So that'll be a good one to tune into if you're interested in that topic. Okay, so on to tonight's topic. So tonight's topic is, or my goal with tonight's, I should say, webinar is to provide sort of a summary of a recent paper that we published in a journal called Communications Biology. And really this, oh, I should note, sorry, someone commented, University of Manitoba, not Winnipeg, University of Manitoba in Winnipeg. Anyways, so tonight's topic, though, is going to be based on this research paper that we published. And I'm going to try to distill it down as simply as I can. It is a fairly, was a fairly complex, I'd say, paper that we wrote with a lot of complex statistics and things like that. So hopefully I'm going to kind of try to grab the big nuggets and not try to get lost in the weeds. There will be some instances where we do kind of have to get in the weeds. And hopefully just bear with me if you get lost. I'll try to answer questions to clarify things at the end. I should note, though, this paper, too, if you want to learn more about the weeds and the details, there's a free PDF of this paper on our website. So you can go to our website and look up this paper and read it for yourself. Okay, so I want to start really broadly here because I think that helps kind of put this work in context. So there's a lot of social carnivores out there, and all or most social carnivores have a lot of the same problems. In particular, they have the same problems when they're trying to raise their offspring. Most large social carnivores have to find and kill prey, and we could categorize this behavior as predation behavior. And then once a kill's made, that's just sort of the beginning of the process, especially when it comes to rearing offspring, because then the adults of those social groups have to consume and they have to digest that prey to nourish themselves, and then obviously to take food back to their pups or to somehow get their pups that food. So we can call the consumption aspect of this feeding behavior. How does an animal in a sort of feed on a carcass that they've killed? And then, like I said, somehow social carnivores have to either get the food back to their pups or they've got to get their pups to the food, one way or the other, right? And we could call this provisioning behavior. Now, wolves are a classic example of a social carnivore. They obviously keep their pups at dens or rendezvous sites when they're young and immobile, and then the wolves leave from that rendezvous site or den site to go find prey that they kill. And then oftentimes these kills are, several miles from where the pups are kept. And then the wolves have to consume that and then somehow get the food back to the pups who are waiting at the den. So for wolves in our area, they're primarily rearing their pups from April to August. Actually, tomorrow is the average date that wolves give birth in our area. And so there's probably some wolves that today just had their pups. And that will start sort of the journey of trying to get those pups from now all the way to adulthood. So it's about a 5-month period when wolves are kind of rearing their pups. The end of August, I should note, is important because that's generally when pups are large enough that they're able to travel around with adults pretty much everywhere they go. So the pups become sort of nomadic like the adults do, and packs kind of stop using rendezvous sites and den sites. So during this pup rearing season in our area, wolves are primarily hunting and killing beavers and deer fawns. And that's the food then they have to get back to their pups. So the goal of our study was to understand the feeding and the provisioning behavior of wolves, and in particular, how those behaviors may or may not be connected. And so we can kind of think about these two behaviors in this way. If we look on the left-hand side, we have feeding behavior. And by and large, this describes how wolves consume or feed on kills. And on the right-hand side, we have provisioning behavior. And this is how wolves move food from their kills to their pups, and if they'll do that at all in some instances. And so we can look at these behaviors scientifically or objectively by measuring different aspects of these behaviors. So if we look at the feeding behavior, for example, we can quantify how wolves feed on their prey by looking at how much time do wolves spend at the kill. We can understand, do they return to the kill after they've left for a while? And if they return, how often do they return? How many returns do they make to that kill? We can also examine how these different variables, such as the time at the kill, a willingness of a wolf to return to a kill, how that varies based on the individual and its social status, what time of year it is, what prey abundance is like, and what type of prey they killed. And similarly, we can look at provisioning behavior a couple of different ways and quantify that a couple different ways as well. So one way we can quantify provisioning behavior is we can look at how often wolves go from their kill and go straight back to their offspring to deliver food. So the probability that a wolf returns to its pups after a kill. We could look at how much food is actually transported to the pups. That's much more difficult and unfortunately not something we can easily quantify in our area. But we can understand how wolves move food back to their pups, and we can understand how that varies based on the individual, their social status, and then the time of year, prey abundance, and type of prey. So a lot of the variables that would influence feeding behavior are also things that might influence provisioning behavior. Now, I have a white bar dividing these two, and the reason why is because most of the work that's been done on wolves and other large social carnivores has really only looked at one of these types of behaviors when they're doing a study. So they either study and focus totally on the feeding behavior of large carnivores or on the provisioning behavior, but they don't look at them at the same time. And the reason for that is it's really difficult to study both of these behaviors sort of simultaneously. And it doesn't take much to really understand why that is. So if you're a biologist, and let's say prior to recent technological advances, if you wanted to understand both the feeding and provisioning behavior of, let's say, wolves, you would have to be able to observe their den and know when wolves are coming and going, as well as go with the wolves to all of their kills to understand where they're making kills, how much time they're spending there, and somehow be able to connect those two. And often in places like northern Minnesota, you can't observe wolves in the first place. And so quantifying these kinds of behaviors was basically impossible. But nonetheless, it's clear, or at least it seemed clear to us, that the feeding and provisioning behaviors of wolves have to be sort of linked processes. So for example, the amount of time wolves are going to spend at a kill is probably going to be dependent on whether or not they have to provision pups or not. If they don't have to provision pups, they'll probably linger around that kill longer, or so it seemed. And so it seemed to us that examining these behaviors independently, while it might have captured some aspects of wolf behavior, looking at them together would be much more fruitful. But like I said, this is not an easy thing to study, or at least historically hasn't been easy to study because of the inability to kind of follow wolves around with sort of their day-to-day lives. But fortunately, recent technology, in particular GPS collars that can take really intensive location data, provide an opportunity to now see where wolves are going and understand when they've made kills and then understand when they go back to their pups. And I should note the GPS collar technology, it only gives us sort of half of the picture because that shows us where the wolves are moving around. But it doesn't tell us exactly what wolves are doing at all the spots they're spending time. And so that's where then intensive field work comes in. And that combination of intensive GPS collar monitoring along with intensive field work makes it possible to understand how the feeding behavior and the provisioning behavior of wolves are sort of connected. And I should also note here that wolves are a really great case study for looking at how these kinds of behaviors are connected. Because during the summer, especially in our area, wolves almost always hunt prey by themselves. So they aren't doing this as a pack during that pup rearing season. And the reason why that makes them a great case study is because when an individual wolf does something at a kill or makes a behavior or makes some decision, we can pretty clearly and confidently assume that that animal's behavior is a result of that individual's decision. And that allows us then to, it makes things simpler for us. For example, it'd be a lot more difficult if wolves were traveling as a big social group, and then, some wolves might just be following the behaviors of other wolves and things like that, and you'd have to try to tease that apart. But in this instance, we can feel pretty confident that when an individual makes a movement or does some sort of behavior, it's the result of that individual's decisions. And then the other reason wolves are nice is that it's easy to quantify where their pups are from the GPS collar movement. So you can follow the movement and pretty easily identify where the den's at. And you can also identify the kill sites based on their movements. So that makes them easy to study as well. So we had 3 objectives that we were interested in understanding. The first is we wanted to understand how individual rearing roles shape feeding behavior. And by rearing roles, we're going to have kind of 2 classes of wolves, for lack of better words. We're going to have the breeding individuals. So these are the parents of the pups. And then the subordinate wolves. These are pack members that obviously are not the parents, but that are part of that social group. And so we wanted to understand how those different demands, or at least relationship to the pups, shapes the feeding behavior of wolves. We then wanted to determine how prey size and type, as well as prey abundance, influence feeding and provisioning behavior. So in our area, wolves are killing deer fawns and beavers primarily. And beavers are much larger than deer fawns. And so one of our questions was, are we going to see different feeding behaviors around these larger beaver carcasses than little deer fawns when they're killed? And then we also want to understand how the amount of prey in a pack's territory or in the whole ecosystem is influencing how wolves feed on carcasses, and then how they also transport food back to their pups. And then lastly, we wanted to understand how feeding and provisioning behavior changes throughout the pup rearing season. So there's a lot of things that change in an ecosystem from April until August. And there's also a lot of biological change with wolves as well during that period. So it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense that these sort of behaviors would remain static for the entire pup rearing season. We would in fact expect there to be changes. And that's one thing we are interested in, is what kind of changes do we observe? Okay, let's see. Okay, so I assume most folks in the webinar probably know that we study wolves in and around Voyageurs National Park in northern Minnesota, but if not, I just figured I'd throw up a map here. This yellow outline is Voyageurs National Park in northern Minnesota, and we study wolves in an area that we refer to as the Greater Voyageurs Ecosystem, which includes Voyageurs National Park, which is this white outline here, as well as a much larger area, which includes a lot of land south of the park. And the Greater Voyageurs Ecosystem sort of encapsulates both of these land types. And that's what this yellow outline here is showing. In this map are just the movements of collared wolves in different pack territories for wolves that we've studied. The areas that are missing territories, or missing, let's say, wolf movements in them are just spots we haven't been able to get collars out yet. And in some of these spots, we've also had some collared wolves shift into these areas, and we need to update this map after this year accordingly. Okay, so it's probably pretty apparent that the only way we could do the kind of work I'm going to describe today is by collaring wolves. So the GPS collars are really integral to getting the work and collecting the data that we need. So every year we collar between 12 to 15 wolves. And then those collars are set to take locations every 20 minutes for the duration of the pup rearing season. And those collars are sending those locations to a website multiple times a day. So we're almost getting the data in real time. And this is an example of what it kind of looks like if you logged on to a website with the collar data. And this is actually a week's worth of data from a wolf from a few years back. So what we do to understand particularly the predation behavior of wolves is we take the locations every week or so from a collared wolf and we run it through a computer algorithm. And that algorithm identifies all of the spots that a GPS collared wolf has remained within a 200-meter area for 20 minutes or more. And the idea here is that anywhere a wolf spends more than 20 minutes within a 200-meter area could be a kill. And so we need to hike into that area and look for evidence that a kill may have occurred there. Most of the times we don't find kills because a lot of instances wolves are just resting or things like that. But we also find a lot of kills through doing this as well. So let's assume this is a week's worth of locations here and we wanted to do clusters. So we would download these locations, run it through the computer algorithm, and on the other side, this is what we would get. And so what we see are a bunch of little clusters of GPS locations, and that's where these wolves have spent a little bit of time. And I'll kind of zoom in on what one of those looks like. And again, it's just a little bunch of locations. So we put all these locations on a GPS, divide it sort of among, or on GPSs, divide it between our field crew, and we all hike out to these different spots and look for evidence of what's going on. So it's fairly intensive work because wolves cover a lot of ground, but it's been very fruitful work as well. So in total, for the study I'm talking about today, we studied 33 wolves from 16 different packs during 2017 to 2022. 20 of those wolves were subordinate wolves, and then 13 were breeding individuals. In total, we searched 17,041 clusters. To give some perspective, estimate that probably required about 20,000 miles of hiking to get to all of those clusters of locations. So like I said, pretty intensive work. But through searching all of these clusters, we were able to identify 901 predation events. 584 of them were fawns, and 317 were beavers. And so, as I mentioned just a little bit ago, one of the things that makes wolves really attractive is that they're solitary predators during the summertime. And this was actually something we examined in this paper as well to kind of assess our assumption that wolves are indeed making choices largely by themselves during the summer and aren't being influenced by other wolves. So we had, during the study, 11 instances where we had 2 or 3 GPS collared wolves in the same pack at the same time, and we were studying their predation behavior simultaneously. And by doing that, we were able to determine that wolves were by themselves at 94% of the kills we identified. And when I say by themselves, we mean they were not with another GPS collared wolf. So we think this is pretty strong evidence that yep, almost all of the time, wolves are hunting and killing prey by themselves. Okay, so when we were searching these clusters of locations and found a kill, we then came back from the field and we recorded a bunch of different information about each kill. And in particular, we recorded these things. The first was we recorded how long was the wolf at a kill. And biologists refer to this as the handling time of a predator. So how long did it take the predator to basically consume and digest that kill it had? And I'm going to use that term handling time in some of the graphs I'm going to show in a bit. And so whenever you hear that term, just think that's the time that wolves spent at the kill. And I'll try to kind of remind folks of that when we get there. So that was the first thing we calculated. How long was the wolf at the kill? The second is we recorded whether or not the wolf returned to the kill. So did it kind of consume the kill, leave, and then come back or not? We also recorded if the wolf went from the kill directly back to the pups without stopping. And this, we think, is strong evidence of the wolf taking food from a kill and then delivering it to the pups who are waiting at a home site. So I'm going to go through a couple of examples of these using GPS collar data so you can actually see what we were seeing and how we were quantifying these things. So this is an example from actually this past year from a breeding male, wolf B2L of the Vermilion River Pack. And you can see here that the den is in this clump, which is obviously quite notable when you kind of see that the wolf is kind of going out and then coming back to that spot. So we found a beaver kill up at these locations here. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit closer on this one again so you can get a better perspective. So we have the den right here, and you can see on these lines there's little arrows which kind of show which way the wolf was moving. So what this wolf did is it left the den and it moved continuously up this way until it found a beaver that it killed right there. And then it came back, spent some time here, and then came back directly to the den, right? And so I'm going to zoom in even closer so you can see this a little better. So this is the beaver kill right here. And then it went this way, and this is where it rested about 500 meters away from the kill. So at this kill, we recorded the following information. And I should back up and note, the way we quantified the amount of time a wolf spent at a kill were the number of GPS locations that were within 200 meters of where the kill site was. So we considered any location within 200 meters was time that was spent at that kill. Okay, so we recorded this information that the date was April 30th. The social status of this wolf, it was a breeding animal. The prey it killed was a beaver. It spent 1.3 hours at the kill in this instance. Did it return to the kill? No, it didn't come back to this kill. Did it go directly to the den after it made this kill? No, it didn't. The wolf did eventually go back to the den not long after the kill, but it didn't go directly back. And that's important, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, but the reason that's important is that if a wolf delays going back to the pups after it's made a kill, that means it's sitting there likely digesting food. And if it's digesting food, that's food that it's not transporting back to the pups. And so I'll come back to this in a bit. Okay, so that's one example. I'm going to show another example here. This is from a couple years ago. This is a breeding male. And again, we have the pups right here. And we have a fawn that was killed right there. So this wolf left the den, went searching for food, found a pup right here, or found a fawn, and went right back to the den. And I'm going to just zoom in a little bit more here so you can see this more clearly. So you can see this is where the fawn was killed right at this location. The wolf did not linger. It just made the kill and went right back. So when we collect data on this kill, we would say that the kill occurred on June 1. The wolf was a breeding animal. Its prey was a fawn. It spent 0.7 hours at the kill, so 40 minutes. Did it go back to the kill? No. Did it return directly after the kill to the den? And the answer there was yes. Almost certainly delivering a large portion of that fawn to the pups. All right, and so then here's one last example, and this is of a subordinate wolf. And this really, I think, shows how different the behavior of wolves can be during the summertime. So we just looked at an example where the wolf spent 40 minutes at a fawn that was killed by wolves. This is an instance where a subordinate wolf killed a fawn at the end of June, and the wolf spent a ton of time at this kill. So if we zoom in once again, we can see that the kill is right here. And what we can see is it looks like just a garbled mess of locations here. And that's because the wolf was just hanging out in the area. And it would leave a couple of times and then come back to feed and do this a little bit. So when we record the data from this wolf, we would say that this kill occurred on the 30th of June. This was a subordinate wolf. It killed a fawn. It spent 50.3 hours. So that's a huge difference, obviously, from the one we were just showing, which was 40 minutes. And then did the wolf return to the kill? Yes, it returned to this kill twice within a 5-day period of the kill occurring. And so that gives us a sort of different snapshot or a set of data to look at these behaviors. And then, did the wolf return to a den directly after the kill? And the answer is no. It just kind of hung out in the area and never went back to the pups. Okay, so that was the kind of information that we were recording on the kills that we found, and we did that for all 900 and some kills we found. We also calculate every single year, and during our study, we not calculate, but we estimate prey abundance across our study area and within each wolf pack's territory. And we do this because prey populations are undoubtedly going to be connected to all sorts of things related to wolves, including their behavior and population changes of wolves as well. So we estimate deer and beaver populations in terms of density, so the number of animals per square kilometer. That's how we estimate deer and beaver populations. But a lot of times biologists want to turn estimates from the number of individuals of certain species into an estimate of biomass, because it's very hard to know, how do we compare, let's say, deer and beaver density? They don't weigh the same. And so so an easier way to kind of get at it is, how much biomass do we have in beavers and do we have in deer? So what's the density of beaver and deer biomass? And a really simple way that biologists have done this for wolves is they kind of come up with what's called a relative biomass unit. And basically all that means is you assume that a deer is a biomass unit of 1, and a deer weighs 75 kilograms on average. A beaver, conveniently, on average weighs about 15 kilograms. And so that's about a fifth the size of a deer. So we can say in terms of biomass, a beaver represents 0.2 biomass units. So then to calculate prey abundance across an area, all we have to do is look at the average density of deer and beavers and convert those to biomass units. So we can take deer here or take this example below, where we have 4 deer per square kilometer and 2 beavers per square kilometer. And if that was the density of deer and beavers, this is a hypothetical example, by the way, we would end up with a biomass unit of 4.4 biomass units per square kilometer. And this is just a way that allows us to assess changes in prey abundance based on biomass instead of the number of individuals or individual prey. Okay, so that gives us sort of the density of biomass across the area. But we have to account for the number of wolves in the system if we really want to understand biomass. And the reason why is that the amount of prey, or how abundant prey is for wolves, really depends on the number of other wolves they have to compete with. So there might be a lot of, let's say, prey, but if there's a lot of wolves, from an individual wolf's perspective, it actually might not be that much food. So I'm going to use this really kind of corny example to maybe drive this point home. So let's assume you're going to a gathering and you show up and there's 10 pounds of cheeseburgers sitting on the table. If there's only 5 people at this gathering, that is an abundance of food for those 5 people. And we can say, yeah, those people are going to be not going to be able to eat all of that. But now let's say that gathering is 50 individuals. Now all of a sudden that 10 pounds of cheeseburgers doesn't seem that much when you have that many people. And so what's really important, as we can see in this example, is looking at the ratio of food to the number of people. And that can be really insightful. And so the same principle can apply for wolves and the amount of prey. So instead of cheeseburgers and people, we could just substitute in prey and wolves, and it would be relatively a similar situation. So when we're trying to understand prey abundance in this study, what we wanted to do is calculate the amount of food per wolf each year. And the way we did that is we took our relative prey biomass index and we divided it by the average pack size in that year, because wolves are going to be competing with their other pack members more or less. And so by taking what prey biomass is and dividing by pack size, we get a ratio of the amount of food per wolf in each pack. Okay, so this is the part where I wanted to put a warning sign that we are going into the graphs and statistics area. And I'm going to try to show a lot of these patterns using graphs. We're going to kind of stay out of the statistical realm as best we can. But the graphs are a bit involved, but I'm not sure of a better way I can show these patterns. So I'm going to walk through them slowly. If for some reason I do a terrible job of explaining some of them, please follow up in the Q&A, and I'm happy to go back to them and walk through them or things like that so that folks can really get the major takeaways from this work. So we're going to start here real basic. So if we look at feeding behavior and looking at the differences between beavers and deer fawns, what we found, and it was very obvious, is that wolves spent a lot more time at beaver kills than they did at deer kills. So these graphs here are histograms. On the y-axis, we have the percentage of kills found. And then we have a sort of just bars showing what percent of the kills occurred in that time frame. And this dashed line here just shows the 2-hour mark. And so what we see from this is that the median time that wolves spent at fawn kills was a little over 2 hours. Whereas for beavers, it was 5.2. So wolves spent substantially longer at beaver kills than fawn kills. And the reason for this is probably quite simple. Most fawns that are killed by wolves are killed shortly after they're born. And shortly after they're born, fawns weigh probably between 4 to 6 kilograms, whereas an adult beaver weighs about 15 kilograms on average. So beavers are going to be much larger, so there's going to be a lot more food to consume, and so it's going to take wolves longer to do that. But what's really interesting is when we break this down looking at breeding animals and then subordinate animals. And what we see are some pretty stark differences. So breeding animals only spent on average about 4 hours at beaver kills, whereas subordinates spent almost 8 hours at beaver kills. So they spent almost twice as long at beaver kills on average. And we see a similar pattern play out with fawns. The typical breeding wolf spent 1.7 hours at a fawn kill, whereas the typical subordinate wolf spent 4.4 hours. And the likely reason here is because subordinate wolves aren't the ones that are primarily responsible for transporting food back to the pups. That's the breeding animals. And so they have different constraints. And I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail soon. Okay, but then what's really interesting about this is while those were sort of average numbers, the amount of time that wolves actually spent at kills across the pup rearing season did not stay static, at least not for breeding animals. So this graph here shows the amount of time breeding animals spent at beaver and fawn kills across that pup rearing season. And on the y-axis here, we have the estimated handling time. And again, handling time just means time spent at kill. And this ranges from 0 hours all the way up to 12 or a little over 12. And so for breeding wolves, what we see is that when the pups are little, the wolves spend very little time at beaver or fawn kills. But as the pup rearing season progresses, we start to see a really substantial increase in the amount of time that these wolves are spending at these kills. But what's really interesting is when we look at subordinate wolves, we don't see that pattern at all. In fact, we basically don't see much change throughout the pup rearing season. These graphs show a slight negative sort of decrease in time spent at kill, but that wasn't a significant pattern there. But what we can see is basically subordinate wolves spend a bunch of time at both fawn and beaver kills throughout the year, regardless of sort of the change in time. And again, this is almost certainly related to provisioning responsibilities. Okay, and I'm going to show this graph, which hopefully isn't super confusing, but it displays this data, that same data I just showed you, but instead of showing the subordinate wolves in one graph and the breeding animals in the other, I'm going to now put the breeding and subordinate wolves on the same graph, but separate them based on the kill types. So here we have fawn kills. And again, we can see this is the breeding animal, this dark orange color, and the subordinate is the lighter color. And we can again see how different these patterns are. And we see the same pattern again with beaver kills, where subordinate wolves, which are this lighter purple, show sort of almost a decreasing trend through the pup rearing season, whereas the breeding individuals show a substantial increase in time at kills. So what's the main conclusion from this sort of first part of the analysis is that there's little change for subordinate wolves, but big changes for breeding wolves in their feeding behavior during the pup rearing season. And we can see this change or this difference in feeding behavior reflected in other patterns and metrics as well. So the graph I'm showing here is looking at the probability that subordinate and breeding wolves will return to a kill they've made to feed on it again. So that's what this means. So the y-axis is the probability of returning to a kill. And 1 is basically means they will always return to a kill. That's 100% of the time they return. 0 means they never do. What we see is that in the beginning of the pup rearing season, breeding individuals only return to kills about 25% of the time, whereas subordinates do so almost 50% of the time. But as the pup rearing season progresses, we see a substantial increase in the frequency at which breeding individuals return to their kills, but we don't see much change in subordinate wolves. But by the end of the pup rearing season, breeding and subordinate wolves are basically returning to kills at about the same level of frequency. Now, this is really the interesting graph, because then what this is looking at is the probability that a breeding or subordinate wolf will return to a home site where there's pups directly after a kill. And so on the y-axis, again, is the probability of returning to the home site after a kill. 1.0 means there's a 100% probability or chance that wolves are going to go back to the kill or go back to the pups after they make a kill. 0 means they never do. And what we see here is that at the beginning of the pup rearing season, wolves are going back to the pups, or breeding wolves, I should say, are going back to the pups about 80% of the time after they make a kill. So they're going straight from their kill and transporting that food right to the pups. For subordinates, though, they don't really do that. Most of the time, they actually don't go to the pups and instead stay at a kill. But what's interesting is we see a really big change for breeding individuals throughout the pup rearing season. So by the time the pup rearing season ends, we see that breeding individuals are only going back to give pups food after kills at about maybe 40-ish% of kills. And we actually see a slight little increase in subordinate wolves going back, but that wasn't a significantly important trend. Okay, so that's a really big takeaway from this is that the breeding individuals are often going back to the pups right after kills. Subordinates aren't. And so I'm just going to kind of show these contrasts, especially for breeding individuals, because they're the ones that are showing so much change throughout the pup rearing season. Again, remember that we basically didn't see any real change in subordinate wolves, or at least meaningful change in subordinate wolves' behavior during this time. Okay, so if we look at the start of pup rearing season, breeding wolves spent little time at kills. They return to kills very infrequently, about 25% of the time, and they go straight back to the pups after almost all the kills, about 80% of them. By the end of the pup rearing season, breeding individuals are spending about 300% more time at their kills. They're returning to the majority of their kills, and they generally aren't going back to the pups after most kills. So big changes. And naturally, that begs the question, why do we see such changes? And the most obvious is that breeding animals are the ones that are primarily responsible for provisioning pups. So the subordinate wolves really are not doing that much provisioning. In other words, the subordinate wolves are mainly concerned with making sure they have enough food for themselves, and they're not really concerned with pups. Whereas the breeding individuals are really concerned with provisioning the pups, and so they're the ones that are making kills and then transporting that back to the pups. But the reason that we see this change likely throughout the pup rearing season is that as pups get older, first of all, they don't need the adults around as much because they're capable of kind of hanging out by themselves. And as the pups get older, they become more capable of traveling around. And that means that adults can meet them somewhere in between a den and a kill, so they don't have to travel as far back to the pups. And in some instances, the pups actually start coming to kills themselves and feeding on those kills directly. And so you see more and more of this behavior as the pups get older and we get further into the breeding season, which is why we likely see adult breeding animals spending more time at kills and less time going back to the dens where the pups generally are at. One other thing worth noting, too, is that during the pup rearing season, the size of, in particular, deer fawns is increasing. So fawns are born in May, and then they're gaining weight. The ones that can survive, they're gaining weight throughout the rest of the pup rearing season. So when a breeding animal kills a fawn in August, there's going to be a lot more food for them to consume than in May. And so naturally, they're going to have to spend more time at that kill to consume it and digest it. So that also is one of the factors probably driving some of these patterns as well. Okay, so then our next question that we're really interested in is how does prey abundance influence these patterns in terms of sort of the feeding and provisioning behavior of wolves? And I should note that I think this is where things start to get really interesting. And I'm going to show a graph that might look kind of scary here next. And I'm going to spend some time so we can sort of digest what this means. So let's start with what's on our y-axis here. So on our y-axis is the estimated handling time. So basically, what is the average handling time for wolves, both breeding and subordinate wolves? And again, handling time is the time spent at a kill. In the left-hand graphs, we have the modeled estimates for breeding individuals. And then on the right-hand side, we have it for subordinate individuals. And then on the x-axis, we have prey biomass per food. So this is our estimate of prey abundance. And again, let's go back to that cheeseburger analogy. This is basically the number of cheeseburgers per person. That's basically what prey biomass per wolf is representing. So the amount of food available per wolf. And so what we see here is that across the board, that as prey biomass per wolf, so as prey becomes more abundant from a wolf's perspective, they spend less time at their kills, regardless of whether they're a subordinate wolf or a breeding wolf, and regardless of whether or not they are killing a beaver or a deer fawn. That's the big takeaway here. Now we have these different colored lines. That's just to represent how these patterns kind of change depending on what time in the breeding or the pup rearing season we're examining. But the big takeaway here is prey biomass as prey biomass per wolf goes up, handling time goes down, and vice versa. So if those graphs made just no sense at all, just remember this, and this will help you kind of understand the big takeaway. So wolves spend less time at kills when prey abundance is higher. Okay, so now we're going to look at some of the other patterns or other variables we were examining and what patterns we see there. So in this graph, what we're looking at is the probability that wolves return to the kill. And that's on the y-axis. And again, this goes from 0 to 1. 1 meaning that they always return to a kill, 0 meaning that they never do. And we looked at how prey biomass per wolf, so how prey abundance influences the willingness of wolves to return to their kills. And what we basically found is not really much of a pattern here. So prey abundance doesn't really influence how often wolves return to their kills. But we see a really interesting pattern when we look at how prey biomass per wolf influences the probability that wolves will return to the home site where their pups are at. And so on our y-axis here, we have the probability that a wolf goes directly from a kill after they make it to the home site where the pups are kept. And that goes again from 0 to 1. 1 being that they always go back to the pups, 0 meaning that they never do. And then on the y-axis or x-axis, we have prey abundance. And what we see here is that as prey becomes more abundant, wolves more often take food back to their pups. And vice versa. As prey abundance decreases, wolves are less likely to go from their kill directly back to their pups. And this was a pattern we saw for breeding and subordinate wolves here. And obviously, this graph, I would say, is probably the most important graph of the whole sort of study because it shows us something really interesting that I think we're going to discuss it, but I think something really interesting biologically. So to kind of summarize these little nuggets, when prey is more abundant, wolves spend less time at their kills, and they go straight back to their pups after their kills more often. So we can put this actually another way that hopefully is more simple if you're having trouble kind of making sense of this. The first is, the way to put it is, wolves provision their pups less when prey is scarce, which essentially means they become more selfish. And by selfish, I don't mean they become more sort of self-absorbed, but really they become more focused on meeting their own energetic needs before they meet that of their pups. So as food becomes less abundant, they obviously have to start prioritizing where their food is going to go, and they prioritize it going to themselves before their pups. And we can see why they might do this. Here's a good example of a wolf in our area in the summertime. They're very lean, and when food is scarce, wolves are really in a tough spot of deciding what they're going to do with the kills, especially when prey is not as abundant. So then the question becomes, well, why do wolves become more selfish when there's less prey? And this probably seems a bit obvious, but I kind of want to walk through all of this. The first is that wolves, when prey is less abundant, wolves are almost certainly killing less prey than when it's more abundant. And because they're killing less prey, that means they're going to be hungrier when they actually make it, or they're going to be hungrier throughout most of the summer, and they're going to be hungrier when they make a kill. And so they're going to be more inclined, likely, to linger at that kill and get as much as they can from it before they go back to the pups. And so obviously, when prey is scarcer, they have to focus on meeting their own energetic demands. The other important thing to note is that there's a real cost for adult wolves if they return to their pups right after the kill. And that cost is losing their meal via regurgitation. So most wolves are transporting a lot of the kills that they make via their stomachs. I mean, they'll carry food back as well, but oftentimes when wolves kill a beaver or a fawn, their stomachs are engorged and they might be carrying something in their mouth, but most of the food is likely in their stomach. And when they get back to a home site with pups, those pups sort of mob adults sort of voraciously, and they're licking at the adults' mouths. And what they're trying to do is solicit sort of a reflex that causes the adults to regurgitate whatever's in their stomach. And that's almost an involuntary reflex by the adults once pups are licking their mouths. And so if wolves go from a kill directly back to the pups, there's a very high probability that they're going to lose a lot of that food. So if they delay returning to the pups, what that means is they likely get to digest and a lot more of that meal, and so they get more calories from it. And so we suspect that's one of the reasons why we see this pattern, is that when prey is scarcer, wolves wait a little bit before they go back to their pups so they get more of those calories. And so what we think this indicates, or is indicative of, is something a little bit larger than just the feeding and provisioning behavior. We actually suspect that this is likely connected to larger population patterns. And in particular, we think that this change in the feeding and provisioning behavior of wolves is a behavioral mechanism that allows wolf packs and populations to quickly adjust to changes in prey populations. And I'm going to walk through sort of that process, or how we think this likely works. So if we assume, or not assume, but let's say we start in a scenario where there's low prey abundance. Low prey abundance likely leads to a reduced ability of wolves to kill prey. And if wolves have a reduced ability to kill prey, they're going to be hungrier. And our work has shown that as prey goes down, wolves definitely reduce the amount that they provision their pups. And as the provisioning of pups decreases, you're almost certainly going to see an increase in mortality of pups. And in other words, there's going to be lower pup survival because pups are going to starve to death because they're not getting enough food. And because pups aren't surviving as well, you're going to see a decrease in pack and population size, because one of, if not the biggest driver of changes in wolf populations are going to be the number of pups that are added to the population each year. So if a large proportion of pups are dying of starvation, you're going to see a pretty quick decrease in pack and or population size. So this is how we think this is sort of the mechanism that we think is occurring. Now, you can also flip this around as well and say the opposite could be true when there's more prey. So when prey is more abundant, wolves have an increased ability to kill prey, so they provision their pups more. That leads to increased pup survival, which leads to a quick increase in pack and population size. But nonetheless, we think this is a mechanism that likely is occurring. which is why, which we think actually makes sense of a lot of other information. For example, we think this makes sense of this pattern that many biologists have noted, which is that many pups starve to death, but adults actually rarely starve to death themselves. And the reason why this is likely the case is that pups can't get food for themselves. They're entirely dependent on adults and what the adults decide to do with the food that they're given. So if adults start becoming more selfish, the pups really have no other option. They just have to wait around to starve. And that certainly seems to be something that happens quite often. And most of the studies that have been done on wolf pups have shown that starvation is one of, if not the most common cause of death of pups. And we think that's the case in our area, that most pups are dying due to starvation. And so in our minds, pup starvation is really a reflection of adult behavior and adult choices. Now, we can actually look at pup survival in our area to see if we see sort of dramatic changes in pup survival from year to year, because if we're right that this is a mechanism that allows wolf populations to quickly adjust to changes in prey populations, we would expect that pup survival might be quite variable from year to year as sort of the wolf population is tracking changes in the prey population. And that is actually exactly what we've been seeing. So from 2019 to present, we've been studying pup survival on an annual basis. And what we've seen is that annual pup survival during that period has ranged from 7% all the way to 52%. And what's actually very interesting is that the years with the highest and lowest pup survival were back to back. So in 2020, we estimate that 7% of pups survived, meaning 93% of them died. And we think most of them died due to starvation. And then the following year, a majority of pups survived, 52%. And that's a huge change. And so it naturally leads to the question of why do you see such dramatic change? And we think it's likely linked to the behavior of the adults and how willing they are to provision pups. And so anyways, we're hoping to continue to study sort of these patterns, but again, we likely think this is a result of the wolf population adjusting to changes in prey populations. Now, I will say one unfortunate thing for us is that we just don't quite have enough data yet on pup survival, especially annual pup survival, to link changes in pup survival to changes in provisioning behavior. And we're going to probably need several more years of data on pup survival to really link the two together or examine sort of the relationship between them. But if we're able to keep the project going, which is looking good, we think that'll be an option one day that we can explore. Okay, so to just kind of recap, big picture findings. What we found in our study is that the feeding and provisioning behavior of wolves are clearly linked to one another. And there's a variety of factors that shape these behaviors and how they're connected to each other. And these factors include the breeding status of an individual. Are they a breeding animal or a subordinate animal? What kind of prey are they killing? How old are the pups, or sort of at what time of the pup rearing season are we looking at? How abundant is prey? And obviously, prey abundance appears to be a big factor that's driving a lot of these behaviors. And ultimately, we think there's good reason to believe that changes in feeding and provisioning behaviors due to changes in prey abundance likely drive wolf pack and population change. And with that, I want to give a big thanks to everyone who supported our project, in particular, the more than 6,100 private donors that have made this project possible. If you're someone who's donated to the project, big thanks for your contributions. And then I want to thank a variety of funding sources, ranging from Minnesota Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund, the University of Minnesota, Voyageurs Conservancy, International Wolf Center, and many other great organizations that have supported the work we do. And with that, I will take any questions that folks have. And just a reminder, please make sure to put your Q&A in the Q&A box and not the chat. Okay. So Barb has a question here. Of the breeding pair, I wonder about the effects of lactation on that wolf's energetic requirements. Did you parse out the breeding female from the breeding male for return to kill data? So that is an excellent question, and certainly is a valuable thing to look at. So unfortunately, we were not able to because we had a small sample size, and so that limited naturally the amount of variables that we could look at. And if we partition out the sex of wolves, that would limit our ability to look at other things. We have no doubt that at the beginning of sort of the pup rearing season, there's going to be a difference between breeding females and breeding males. And we see that in just the GPS collar data. Typically, the breeding females are going to linger at the den with the pups for about the first 3 to 4 weeks. And the breeding male is going to be kind of the workhorse of the pack at that time. He's going to be going out, killing food, bringing the pack, or bringing food back to provision not only the pups, but also, or he actually can't provision the pups at that time. He can provision the female, who then can provision the pups via lactation. So all this to say, great question. We didn't have the data at the time to really look at that. But hopefully as we continue to do this work and continue to explore these patterns, that's something we'll be able to look at. Okay. So Missy asks, in wolf education, I found that as group educators tend to communicate that the entire pack helps with provisioning pups to improve the chances of survival. Your work would seem to indicate that this is not the case. Based on what you learned, would you recommend educators change how we discuss this? Would you suggest some better ways to talk about the provisioning behaviors by subordinates? That is an excellent question, and is also a challenging one, because we need to keep in or take into account the variability in probably wolf behavior across their range. So in our area, for example, the patterns we've found are the result of packs that are very simple and they're very small. So the average pack in our area is 4 to 5 wolves on average. We don't have very large packs. There is work from places, let's say in Yellowstone and Idaho and other places out west, where packs are much larger and you have a lot more subordinates that are likely helping. And they might not be helping a lot, but you can imagine, let's say you have 2 subordinates that are kind of pitching in some food, but now instead of having 2, you go out west and you've got 8 that are all pitching in some food. Each individual might not be providing a ton, but the accumulation of all of those individual subordinates sort of providing food could be substantial, which also could be why when you look at patterns in pup survival, you actually see generally much higher pup survival rates in places like Yellowstone, Idaho, etc., than you do in places like Minnesota, where you have smaller packs. And that likely is a function of the size of the prey that those wolves are killing. So when you have big prey out west, that means more wolves can get food from those kills, which might mean that more subordinates stick around, which might also then mean those subordinates pitch in to help raise the pups at least a little bit. So hopefully that isn't too confusing, but really it's getting at this point of what I would recommend is to understand that context and location is very important. And in particular, provisioning behavior is also likely connected to the size of prey that those wolves are relying on. And that's one of the big differences you see between from our area and, let's say, places out west. In our area, wolves are eating small prey, and out west they're generally going after larger prey, which changes behaviors. Karen asks, do you take lactation into account? Okay, so you answered that one. Are pups more likely to starve after 3 weeks old? In low prey years, do breeding females spend less time at the den after feeding? So let's start with the one about pups more likely to starve after 3 weeks. So from the work that's been done on wolf pup survival, most indicates that pup survival is really high for the first 4 or 5 weeks of life, and maybe a bit longer than that. So generally pup survival is pretty high, but it's when the pups start getting larger that they need more food. And as those pups are getting larger and getting further into the summer, a lot of the wolves' main prey is actually starting to get a bit scarcer. And so it seems that most starvation of pups actually occurs in sort of the latter part of the summer. So that would be July and August in particular, and then also into the fall. So there doesn't seem to be a lot of starvation when the pups are little because the pups don't need as much food at that time. But they need a lot more food when July and August hits because they're a lot larger. We have not looked at whether or not we see differences in den attendance in breeding females when prey is high or low. But that's something that would be very interesting to look at going forward. Okay. Kristen asks, can wolves control what portion of their stomach contents they regurgitate? Do they ever reconsume what they regurgitate if pups don't eat it all? I'm not sure if anyone knows how well they're able to control how much they regurgitate. Maybe they are to an extent, but what's really interesting is if you ever watch any video footage of wolves coming back, adult wolves coming back to pups, it's pretty amazing how intensively the pups go after the adult. I mean, they're just constantly going after the adult's mouth, and you can see adults almost seemingly like they're trying not to regurgitate almost, but then they generally eventually do. So I'm not sure how much wolves are able to control how much food they actually give out. Maybe they are, but from what I've read, I haven't heard anything to that effect. Do they ever reconsume what they regurgitate? I have no doubt that they would probably reconsume them, regurgitant, if it was there. But I'm guessing there's very little left because the moment they regurgitate, I'm guessing there's very steep competition between the pups over access of that food. Okay. You've talked about wolves bringing kills back to pups at the den. What about wolves calling pups to a kill? I have observed several times in the VWP study area what seems like an adult wolf howl followed by pups returning the call, which, based on your own feedback as well as others, is likely an adult wolf learning the pack to a kill. Is that accurate? And if so, do you have any data that would indicate how often a pack, including pups, come to a kill as opposed to an adult bringing the kill back to the den? Sorry, I know that's a huge question. That was part of the question. No worries about that. That's a great question. So certainly wolves will call pups, try to find pups and get them to come so they can give them food, or maybe even call them to kills. In terms of howling, we don't have a great answer for that. There's a lot of instances when wolves howl and it doesn't have anything to do with kills. It's just a way to maybe locate where other wolves are at. But wolves, particularly breeding females, do actually have a sound they make that they use to kind of find pups and communicate that there's food or get the pups to come to them. And it's sort of this whimpering, I don't know how to describe it, almost whining noise. And sometimes if you watch our videos, you can actually hear the adults, and they'll continue to do this into the fall even, where they will make this noise, and that kind of calls the pups to come running. And that's one way that that wolves are likely finding pups. Now, what they might do is they might not be howling, but they might have made a kill, have their stomach full of food or something, and they're bringing it back to the pups. But let's say it's late July or August, the pups might not be at that rendezvous site. They might be wandering around doing who knows what. And so the female might be trying to locate the pups. And so she might be making vocalizations, which then allows the pups to hear her when she's moving around and come to her to get food. So there's certainly vocal communication that is going on here. It's definitely challenging to study in a place like ours. So all we got are little snippets of insight. So I don't have anything really formal beyond sort of those anecdotal observations we've had. In terms of how often the pups go to kills, that's also something we don't have great data on. We really wish there was an easier way. We really wish there was an easier way to track pup movements, but there's really no easy way to do it right now. And so a lot of times we don't know if pups are at a kill. Sometimes we go to kills and we'll find smaller scats that we think are indicative of the pups being there. But that kind of becomes subjective because by the end of July, early August, pups are getting quite large. It can be tough to differentiate their scats from adults. And so that's somewhat subjective. Ideally, we'd love to have someday a way to track the movement of pups, which would allow us to answer questions like that, as well as many others. So has the Minnesota DNR reached out to you or Voyager's Voyager's address, Hubbard County, trying to delist the wolf on the endangered species list? I'm a Hubbard resident, and I'm on the wolf side, not the hunters. I suspect that question's basically asking if anyone's reached out to us regarding wolf delisting. We have not been reached out to by anybody, and haven't discussed with any government folks, state or otherwise, about delisting in any way. Karen says, how do you suppose adults determine prey density? Time between kills, maybe? Now that is a really interesting question, and that is something biologists have spent a lot of time, not just for wolves, but other animals, of how do you understand, how an animal is aware of how much food is out there. And with wolves, what likely is the case is they probably can sense how much effort they have to expend to probably encounter animals, and then once they encounter one, find one that is actually vulnerable. And so from a predator's perspective, those are two really important things: encounter rates, and then also kill rates once an encounter has been had. And my suspicion is that as prey density is going down, wolves can sense it. They need to expend more energy to actually find or encounter prey. And then of those, then they have to expend, of the ones that they encounter, only a certain percentage are going to be vulnerable to predation. And so you're likely going to see that wolves can sense the changes in encounter rates. And they probably can sense their own hunger as well, as they're kind of wandering around saying, I'm hungry and I'm having trouble finding prey that I can kill. Okay, so Sean asks, or says, hey, Tom, as always, great job. Thank you. Was the data consistent across the various packs within your data sets? For example, were there any packs that were outliers? So in this analysis, we basically didn't have the statistical sample size to really compare differences across packs. To look at that, because there's so many different packs that we were studying, we would need a really large data set that would allow us to really look at that. And so we really didn't look at any substantial patterns between individuals or between packs. We did incorporate, and this is getting a bit statistical, but we did incorporate a random effect or a random intercept for individual wolf IDs, which basically says that the behaviors of individual wolves are likely going to be unique potentially to that individual wolf. And so when we're kind of running our models, we have to account for that in the data set. So we did incorporate that, and that's where we think it accounted for a lot of or helped us kind of account for that individual level variation here. All right, Barb asks, will you examine how babysitting behavior of subordinates affects the provisioning behavior of the breeding pair? Excellent question. We certainly want to look at what's called home site attendance, which is essentially babysitting behavior. So basically, how much time do wolves, both breeding and subordinate wolves, spend at the den or rendezvous sites with the pups? And how does that change through time? And that probably is also somewhat connected to these patterns of prey abundance and things like that. We didn't look at that in this paper because that is sort of its own pretty large study and analysis that would have to be done, but certainly is something that we have the data for and would like to look at it going forward. All righty. Carol asks, did you find that there's a difference in nutritional value between beavers and deer/fawns? Is deer meat leaner, beaver meat fatter? Never looked at these. We've never taken a beaver, assessed its, measured its fat content, and then done that with a deer fawn. But just sort of knowing the two animals, it seems very likely that beavers certainly have higher fat content because they just are fattier animals. And particularly like beaver tails are full of fat and things like that. Deer fawns are pretty lean, especially when they're first born. So unlikely there's a lot of fat there in deer fawns. But, so anyway, so I should note though that while that likely is the case, that's sort of an anecdote on my end. I don't know that for certain because we've not measured them. But I highly doubt that that probably plays much of a role in which one wolves are going after. I suspect wolves are just going after whatever food they think they can, or whatever prey they can successfully catch and kill the most. Some folks have asked us, do wolves prefer beavers over deer? And my guess is wolves prefer the easy meal, whatever that is, whether that's fawns or that's beavers. And a good example of this is in May is when wolf predation on beavers peaks. And when and that's because in May, young beavers are leaving their colonies or their families and they're wandering across the landscape, largely in shallow streams and sometimes over land, to find a new home, and wolves pick off a lot of them. So we see a real peak in predation on beavers in May, and right when deer fawns are born, all of a sudden we see a really quick drop in the number of beavers that wolves are killing, and wolves quickly switch to going after deer fawns. And that's likely because they're just following whatever is most abundant and available at that time. Okay, Celia Matke asks, at what age are pups able to contribute to feeding themselves, making the breeding and subordinate wolves less responsible? Are they fed throughout their first winter? So most of their first year of life, the pups are likely largely dependent on the adults to at least catch and kill the food. And certainly when they're really little, let's say up to 5 months of age, they're entirely dependent on the adults for getting food, and then somehow either probably helping the pups get to those kills or moving the kills back to the pups via regurgitation and things like that. Um, Obviously, though, as time goes on and the pups get older, the pups are able to come to the kills more readily because they're able to travel more readily. And so the adults don't have to put in as much work to provision those pups. But the pups really aren't probably able to be sort of functional helpers in killing prey until probably the latter part of their first winter. And probably for much of their first year of life, the pups are likely not the ones that are leading hunts and things like that. It's largely the breeding pair, and let's say other older subordinate wolves in that pack that are the ones doing that, and then the pups are then just feeding on those kills. All right, Christy asks, at what age do pups start eating their own food, aka carcasses? So pups will start eating solid food about 5 to 6 weeks after they're born. So pretty early on, pups are able to start consuming it, but they consuming meat and things like that. They obviously at that age can't crunch bones or things like that. That requires sort of their milk teeth being replaced eventually by their adult teeth and things like that. But by the middle of the, or early to middle of the summer, pups are able to start chewing on bones. They're starting to consume more and more sort of harder stuff. And certainly by the fall, they're eating all sorts of normal stuff that wolves eat, which is bones and meat and all of that sort of stuff. Okay, Sue asks, do you know the typical age that pups are moved to a rendezvous site? How close are the rendezvous sites to den locations? And if they are close together, is it accurate to say your study looks at wolves returning both den sites and rendezvous sites, or are the rendezvous sites far enough away from dens that they would not be counted as a return to den? Okay, that is another good question, and a great thing for me to clarify here. So we looked at the probability that wolves will return to home sites. And a home site is either a den or a rendezvous site. So when pups are young, which is usually from about from the time they're born to about 6 weeks of age, pups are kept largely at dens, which are going to be physical structures that provide some sort of shelter and or camouflage for the pups. At about 6 weeks of age, wolves are going to move their pups from dens to rendezvous sites. And rendezvous sites are going to be a bit different. They're going to be like above ground den sites. They're going to be more of a spot that the pups just kind of hang out. There's not going to be as much of a physical structure, but rather it's just going to be sort of a centralized location that the pups are going to kind of hang out. And then that's a spot where all the other wolves can rendezvous and interact with the pups and one another. So dens and rendezvous sites aren't really being used at the same time. Rather, it's a transition from one type of location where they can raise their pups to another type of location. Sometimes den and rendezvous sites can be a short period or a short distance from one another, let's say 200-300 meters, and other times they could be 2-4 kilometers apart. And it's also important to note that wolves in our area often use multiple dens and then multiple rendezvous sites, and they're using them sort of sequentially. So the pups will be born in a den and stay there for 2 weeks. Then the adult will move them to another den for a week, and then another den for maybe 2-3 more weeks, and then to a rendezvous site. And they might stay at that rendezvous site for a month, and then move, and then stay at another rendezvous site for a week, and then move again. So the pups are getting moved relatively frequently throughout the summer. And so wolves are just changing where they return to as a result. And we factored all of that into our analysis. And so anytime a wolf went back to a den or a rendezvous site, we considered that a return to basically provision pups. Do you have any information on wolf kills during winter? So yes, we do, and that actually comes from this winter. So we've been wanting for a long time to start doing a winter predation study, but we really haven't had the capacity to do it because most of our effort has been focused on understanding the summer ecology of wolves from April until the end of October primarily. But we've gotten to a point in the project where we now have sort of the logistical and funding capacity to start looking at that. And so we started studying the predation behavior of 2 packs this winter from February until the end of March. And we will be sharing some of those. We're still kind of wrapping up the data entry aspect of that work. And we're hoping to kind of summarize that information in a report that we can then share online probably later this summer or something like that. So that folks can see that. And one of the reasons we started as well this winter is that Minnesota has had a historically mild winter. It's been kind of very, very strange. And so we thought there was no better year to start studying predation behavior than to do it in sort of a record mild year, which gives us sort of a baseline of what wolf predation is like when winters are really mild. And then hopefully we'll see as we move forward variability in winter severity and look at how that influences wolf predation patterns as well. Okay, so then there's another question here that says, is there a way of knowing what internal parasite loads are affecting wolf provisioning behavior? Are parasite loads generally fairly consistent among neighboring packs? So we have not really examined parasite loads in any real capacity. I'm sure there are ways you could do that if we wanted to. It really just comes down to a capacity issue of what sort of things we want to focus on. And that's not been one we at least have time or the desire to look at right now. Certainly would be fascinating to look at, just don't have the ability to do that right now. Okay, those are the questions that are in the Q&A. Are there other questions that folks have that they would like me to answer while we have some time here? Any questions? I'll give it about a minute or two and then we'll... Oh, someone asks, what are the fossils on the shelf behind you? These are all skulls. A lot of them are ones that I've just found in the woods here doing field work. And there are all sorts of stuff. We have a beaver, deer. The one is a wolf, which is a specimen that we collected for one of the collared wolves that we've sort of kept for archiving for our research. And then there's a variety of other random stuff. Okay, Shayla asks, what proportion of wolves do you have collared? You said collared wolves weren't near another collared animal. How confident does that really mean you are that they were alone? Okay, excellent question. So so let's back up and note most packs we studied, we didn't have more than one wolf collared in them. We just had a single wolf collared. But we had 11 instances where we had 2 or 3 wolves in a pack. Now that might seem like, well, there's got to be a lot of wolves in that pack that you don't have data on. But in most instances, the 2 collared wolves is 50% of the pack, if not maybe more than that. Because coming out of winter, average pack size is about 4 to 4.5 wolves in our area. So assuming the pack remains at the same size all winter, or all summer, sorry, that would mean we have about 50% of that pack collared. But what typically happens at the end of a winter is that subordinate wolves that are a year old or 2 years old start dispersing. And so most wolf packs actually shrink in size pretty quickly once the summer hits. So to have 2 wolves collared often means that we have probably the majority of a pack collared, if not the entire pack collared. So there were several instances where we had both of the breeding pair collared at the same time, and the pack was just those 2 breeding individuals. So we feel pretty confident that this is a really good representation of how often wolves are with other wolves. It's of course not perfect, it's an estimate, but we think it's a really good estimate and generally captures what we see as well in terms of wolf movement, because not only do we have data on wolves killing prey with other wolves, but we also have how often are these wolves moving together with one another. And we also have trail camera data during the summer, which shows how often are wolves with other wolves throughout the summer. We haven't quantified that data yet. That's something we're hoping to do going forward. But just anecdotally, from the data we have from GPS collars, from two wolves that are in the same pack, as well as trail camera data, during the summertime, wolves are pretty much always by themselves. It's very rare to see multiple wolves traveling together during that period. Christy asks, how do you count the number of pups that die? Another interesting point. So we have, so the way we estimate pup survival, I should say, has pros and cons. The way we estimate pup survival is we go into dens and when the pups are about 4 weeks old, and we count the number of pups that are in that den, and we also tag each pup that we count. So that gives us an idea of how many pups are in that pack to start. And then the way we determine how many pups actually survive to adulthood is by putting out lots of trail cameras in each of the pack's territories and seeing how many pups are still alive come wintertime. And the pups are pretty easy to distinguish from the adults because they have different faces and physical appearances. And then we try to get multiple repeated observations of these packs so that we feel pretty confident in the number of pups that are in each pack. So it's not just like, oh, we got one observation of 2 pups in that pack. We ideally want 10, 12, 15 observations so we feel really confident that we know how many pups are alive in that pack. And so that gives us a survival rate. So we can say, okay, that pack had 5 pups in April, and there's only 2 alive at the end of January or something. So we can say, okay, there's a 40% survival rate. The negative is that we often don't know why pups die. And that's the frustrating thing. We would love if there was a way that we could mark pups. So, I mean, there are ways you can mark pups, but we're not comfortable with them right now. So some folks have put little expandable collars on pups. Those seem to work, but we're just not quite comfortable doing that ourselves until we see much better data that that's a safe and effective way to do it. Other people have used actually surgically implanted transmitters, and that, again, is not something we're interested in doing. And so there's really no great way to follow pups around and then know why they die. Now, we have opportunistically found pups that have been dead, and we can kind of figure out why they likely died. And so, for example, the year when we had 7% survival rate, we found a lot of pups that year pretty amazingly. I think we found 7 pups, and a lot of times it looked like the carcasses just fell apart there. And that to us suggests that they weren't killed by other wolves, but they were just, or other predators, they just died. And we can also see in our trail camera video footage during that year that a lot of pups looked really emaciated and really gaunt. And if you go on our social media, look at the videos back, I think it was maybe half a year ago, we shared a video actually that showed pups. And it's kind of a hard video to watch, but you can see the pups are basically just emaciated and almost certainly not going to make it. So that's how we know the number of pups that survive. And hopefully someday we'll be able to track pups a bit more effectively and determine why they didn't live and what killed them. Teresa asks, did you find a hierarchy of feeding adults pups first at kills? Well, that's another great question about wolf biology as a whole. So we didn't look at that, in part because we can't observe wolves on their kills, so we can't really observe that hierarchy. But other research has looked at this, and generally what happens is that when breeding adults make kills, they're going to make sure that their pups are going to get access to that carcass before other subordinate wolves. And this is actually thought to be one of the main mechanisms that actually forces older subordinate wolves to leave a pack and disperse and go looking for their own. Basically, there's this intense competition, and the adult breeding animals actually prevent subordinate wolves from getting to the carcass because they let the other young pups get there first. And so those subordinate wolves that are now 1 or 2 years old realize that the grass is greener not being part of that pack because they're tired of, let's say, having this intense competition for access to kills, and so they leave. And so this is, so that hierarchy certainly is very important when thinking about sort of how wolf packs and the social structure of packs operates, just not something we can easily get at in our area. Karen asks, you mentioned likely differences in pup rearing behavior in Yellowstone. Is there data from anywhere else, Alaska, Canada? Well, there's certainly data from Idaho. A lot of the studies, though, that are not from Yellowstone are a bit different because in Yellowstone, they can observe wolves a lot better than you can in a lot of other places. And so that makes Yellowstone somewhat unique in that regard. But there's a lot of other studies that have been done that have looked at patterns between pup survival, how many subordinate helpers there are, how in and sort of pack structure and stuff like that, and certainly ones in Alaska as well. But a lot of the main studies that have looked at sort of how helper, and they're sometimes called helper wolves or subordinate wolves, influence pup survival. A lot of that work's been done in Yellowstone and in Idaho primarily. There are a few other places. But again, it's also one of those things too that it's very difficult to look at because if you really want to understand meaningful patterns between, let's say, the amount of subordinates in packs and their contribution to pup rearing behavior, you have to have a pretty long data set to be able to look at those changes through time. You have to be able to understand what happens when prey populations change, and then what happens to pack structure and things like that. And reality is most wolf projects don't just last long enough to be able to look at that. Fortunately, there are some that have gone on for a very long time and they've provided great information. But there's a lot of them that just aren't around long enough. They might be 3 or 4 years, which is based on, let's say, a grant they got, and then it kind of ends. And it's really hard to get at some of these patterns if you only have 3 or 4 years of data. Another person asks, are pups that are not tagged get moved to different dens and rendezvous sites as often as pups that are tagged? So we haven't looked at this ourselves, whether or not basically the question is like, are dens, I'm guessing the question is that when we visit dens, do those wolves move the pups around more than for dens where we don't move or we don't visit and interact with the pups? My impression is that there's not really much of a difference. We see packs, regardless of whether or not we go into the den or not, moving around very often. And we see that as well. If you look at other studies, people have examined how do researchers visiting dens influence, let's say, pup survival, the movements that wolves make. And there's really been there's not really been any data to suggest that people visiting dens, at least for research, really have any impact on the sort of long-term movements of wolves and their pups. Certainly short-term, that will happen. So when you visit a den, wolves are almost always going to move those pups to a new den. But because wolves are moving pups around all the time anyways, that movement itself isn't really a perilous thing for those pups. And there's been work in other places that has shown that it has actually watched wolves after they've been disturbed by people at a den and shown that those wolves are able to successfully move the pups from a den to another den without any pups dying or anything like that. Any other questions? I'll give it about a minute here, and then if there's no other questions, we'll wrap it up. Sue says, can't think of any questions, but wish I could because your presentations are always very well done, very interesting and informative. Really just enjoy hearing you talk about wolves in your research, and I'm happy that I'm able to be a supporter of your work. Well, thanks a bunch, Sue. We really appreciate the support and are glad folks enjoy the webinars. And it's honestly a really fun time for us to be able to connect with folks as well and to be able to answer questions and clarify things like this. So I'm not seeing any other questions, so I think we're going to wrap it up here. But again, thanks everybody. Really appreciate it, and hopefully we'll see many of you at our last webinar in a couple of weeks.